Friends, colleagues, it's a great pleasure and honor to be able to introduce Chancellor Scholz, who has been extremely loyal to us, having been at this summit a good number of times before. Chancellor Scholz has inspired us in ways that he himself probably is not fully cognizant of. We have taken his climate club principles and applied them to many other areas of global problem solving. He has devoted himself tirelessly to the ambition of a peaceful, inclusive, and sustainable world. And he is one of these rare politicians who knows what it means to have mutual respect in a time of a multipolar world and to handle collective, shared problems collectively. So we have come a long way from the times of Winston Churchill, who was able to define diplomacy as a way of telling people to go to hell in such a way that they ask for directions. In this multipolar world, we need to act collectively, and Chancellor Scholz has shown us the way. He has introduced a new word to the English language, Zeitenwende, which has been appropriated much more broadly than opposing might makes right. So it is a great pleasure and honor to welcome Chancellor Scholz, and please, Chancellor, you have the stage.
Ja, sehr geehrter
Professor Snow, ladies and gentlemen, it's good to be back with you today. Moving beyond the crisis is this year's headline and title. Crisis being used in the singular, and given the multiple disputes and armed conflicts, the multiple global challenges, given the multiple crises, quite a few of us would probably have voted for and opted for the plural in the title. However, I believe that the title, bearing the crisis in the singular, has been well chosen because it conveys an idea that I believe to be of central importance. There are no isolated crises. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine has led to a global rise in food and energy prices. The pandemic has torn great holes into the national budgets around the globe. The consequences are being felt even today, especially in the poorest countries. And climate change per se poses a global threat with an impact on our economies, finances, health, security, and politics. The historian Adam Tooze once coined the term polycrisis for these interlinked and interdependent challenges. For me, I associate two things with this expression, with this term. First, it is not sufficient to look in isolation at each and every one of these developments: wars, energy crisis, inflation, debt, climate change, and migration. And even more importantly, it is not enough if individual countries or regions attend only to the problem that is geographically or politically closest to them. Given the limited means of even the most influential countries, we can at best alleviate the local symptoms of a global polycrisis. However, the polycrisis per se is for all of us too big to ignore, but it is possible to manage it. For this to be successful, the question of what are the interests of Africa, Latin America, Asia is just as relevant as is the question of what is the position of Russia on the topic of A, B, or C. The Global Solutions Summit has dedicated itself to this necessary globalization of our thinking and our search for a solution, and I would like to thank you for that. The term polycrisis, by the way, is not just another word for resigned inaction. According to the motto, if everything is somehow linked to everything, where are we to begin? I would like to speak about 3 areas where global effort is called for and where we have overlapping interests and realistic approaches towards a solution. First, in a world with 10 billion, as there will be by mid-century, inhabitants, climate neutrality is not wishful thinking for idealists. It is of existential importance for our planet and a precondition for growth and prosperity. What gives me reason to be confident is that our common efforts to reduce the impact of climate change is bearing fruit. All signatory states to the UN Climate Convention have drawn up national climate action plans for this decade. And at the same time, 78 countries have presented long-term strategies for greenhouse gas neutrality by the mid of the century. And from this emanates a clear message directed to investors and companies, and that is that transformation in the direction of climate neutrality is irreversible. There cannot and will not be a return to the fossil era. The consensus we reached at the COP in Dubai last year is proof of that. We aimed to triple renewables, double energy efficiency, and to transition away from fossil fuels. Despite all geopolitical disruptions, and I will expand on that later, the G20 have played a decisive part in this regard. At the summit in Delhi, we succeeded in agreeing concrete targets for the expansion of renewables and energy efficiency. But allow me also to identify the problems here. Probably the biggest problem is to do with the fact that we need to mobilize the funds needed for a transformation of the global economy in the direction of climate neutrality. UN experts estimate that we will need 125 trillion euro in global investments in order to be climate neutral by 2050. And that estimate alone goes to show that public funds provided by classic industrialized countries will not suffice, never. To avoid any misunderstanding, the industrialized countries stand by their responsibility to make available funds for mitigation and adaptation to climate change. But even if we were to increase the funds multiple times, which is simply unrealistic, we would not get where we need to be. In order to be successful, global climate finance has to be geared much more towards mobilizing private investment. It's the economy, stupid. This needs to be said here too. Of course, as we step into and set out for the post-fossil era, new economic opportunities and lucrative business models will be opened up. Think, for example, of setting up a global hydrogen market or the potential of many countries to become exporters of renewable energy instead of importers of fossil fuels. However, at the beginning of any business model, there is the question of the funding, which is especially difficult for developing and many newly emerging economies. This is why we have to do something about it, by, for example, having our development banks providing guarantees for such investments, or by corporations like the Just Energy Transition Partnerships. One contribution that Germany has been making, and that I believe to be very important, is the so-called Climate Club. You mentioned it earlier. We have by now 38 members of this club. It is in this club that we are working to draft common standards for more cooperation, more transparency, and more convergence in the decarbonization of our industries. We're busy right now drafting a common definition for green steel, for example. And private investments, last but not least, also hinge on good investment conditions in the respective countries. And this is the purpose, amongst others, of the G20 Compact with Africa. When we last met in Berlin last November, we agreed with our African partners to cooperate even more closely on energy and green hydrogen. We, the G7, have been supporting this endeavor through the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, which we created in El Mau. In so doing, we're providing incentives for billions of private investment in global infrastructure, especially in developing countries and emerging economies. This approach, using public funds to allow for and to leverage private investments, is the only promising one in view of the dimension of the energy and climate transition. The second area that I would like to speak about is the following. We need concrete solutions for the reform of the international financial architecture and the international debt situation. Germany has thus strongly supported a reform of the World Bank, and we have achieved quite a bit. At the annual meeting in Marrakesh last year, a new priority was decided for the World Bank. Fighting poverty now goes hand in hand with preserving our livelihoods and protecting global public goods. And what I just said on climate finance is also true for the World Bank. We need more bang for the buck. Through our financial support, too, we demonstrate that we are serious about reforming the World Bank. As the first country in the world, Germany has pledged more than 300 million euro hybrid capital to the World Bank last year. And these funds will allow the World Bank to increase its lending and to leverage private investments, very often with a factor of 1 to 8 or 1 to 10. Since then, 10 partners joined this idea of offering hybrid capital and guarantees. In the next 10 years, the World Bank will thus be in a position to grant loans to the amount of $70 billion. That is a beginning, and I believe it to be a new, much smarter way than just sticking to the traditional categories of loan and grant. It helps and is beneficial to low-income countries. Twice as many of them are facing a debt crisis or are about to enter into one compared to 10 years ago. And with the common framework, the G20 created a mechanism that allows us to restructure debts and to achieve sustainable solutions for our partners. But despite the debt crisis, we are only making slow headway with this mechanism. Only a few countries have shown interest, and thus we have to ask ourselves, what can we do to improve the situation? I could think of, for example, making more efficient and more standardized processes available, or opening the common framework for countries for middle-income countries. And it is also clear that China, as one of the main creditors, has to participate more in order to reduce the debt burden on the poorest countries. And I talked about this, amongst others, with President Xi when I visited Beijing recently. In order to strengthen sustainable growth in Africa, Asia, and South America, however, we have to do more than just engage in debt management. We also have to ensure that income increases on the ground through more value creation. And Germany supports the idea that more value creation in the processing of raw materials ought to take place in the countries in which the raw materials are being mined or where renewable energy is being produced. And we were quite successful in ensuring that this principle is also being prioritized in the EU Critical Raw Materials Act, which was passed in April this year. It offers great potential for economic cooperation with our partners in Africa, Asia, and South America, and their sustainable development. The implementation of the reforms in the area of corporate taxation is another important contribution to increased income. After lengthy negotiations in the OECD, we have agreed a model that is being supported by more than 100 countries, and I believe that to be a major success. But there are still too many loopholes that enhance the inequality in the competition. So we'll keep at it, because this is a question of global justice. And the third area that I'd like to speak about concerns the question of war and peace. Through Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and the terrorist attack of Hamas on Israel, with all the impact these have had, it has become the determining question for international cooperation in our world today. And it does have the potential of doing lasting and profound damage to our cooperation. Instead of blaming each other for pursuing double standards, we should remember and remind ourselves of the global standard that is out there and that protects all of us, the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. And with regard to Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, it means that we cannot and will never accept that borders are being changed through the use of force. Either we all stand together to defend principles like independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity, or otherwise, we will be putting them at risk for each and every one of us. And I've described the global impact that Russia's war of aggression has had at the outset of my speech: inflation, energy crisis, food scarcity, and so on and so forth. The more countries like China, Brazil, India, and others indicate and make it clear to Russia that it is enough, this war has to end, Russia must withdraw its troops, the greater the chances for lasting peace, and the greater the chance that diplomatic efforts like the initiative pursued by Switzerland to host a peace conference will bring us closer to a just peace. That the Global South plays an important part here and has to play an important part here is indeed a mirror of a world in a polar crisis, as I described it at the outset of my speech. And it is also in the interests of our partners in the G20 to send out a signal for a lasting and a just peace for the Ukrainians. For without peace, there can be no sustainable development. The international law and the principles of the United Nations are also our standard with regard to the conflict in the Middle East, and this means first and foremost that Israel has the right to defend itself against the terror of Hamas. At the same time, even in war, rules apply. Even in this war, rules apply, which means that Hamas has to release all innocent hostages. It has it in its hands to put an end to the bloodshed. And Israel has the duty to protect civilians and to allow humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip. Germany and the United States, too, have made their contribution towards providing aid to the civilian population in Gaza. Aid, food, medicine, and other aid goods. But more of that has to be allowed into Gaza. For this to happen, we finally need a longer-lasting ceasefire, which at the same time ensures that the Israeli hostages are being finally released. And we also finally need a perspective for a lasting solution to the conflict, a solution that allows for peaceful coexistence and interaction between Israel and the Palestinian state. Ladies and gentlemen, well, it's a fact. We are confronted with multiple interconnected challenges, and there's little to indicate that this is going to change soon. It is our duty, however, to not give in to resignation in the face of these challenges, but to look ahead with open eyes. For there are also solutions out there if we cooperate globally, governments, think tanks, and civilian society. This is what this event is about, and I would like to thank you for that. Thank you very much.
I think we have gained an insight into the broad worldview that inspires the Global Solutions Summit, from distinctive pathways to common goals, to an international world order that supports peace and sustainability. I thank you very much indeed.